Good morning. I'm Lucy Beadnell with the Arc of Northern Virginia, and we were so pleased to be asked by the Fairfax Falls Church Community Services Board to give a talk about what to expect while you're waiting for a DD waiver. And I know we're all incredibly excited about all the waiver news that has been going around and some really amazing progress we're going to be able to make on our waiting list. It's shifting a lot of our brains from the mentality I feel like we've all gotten stuck in for many years, which is, am I ever going to get help? When is this waiver ever going to come? To, oh my goodness, time to get ready. And how do I do that? And that's what we'll be working through today. I'm really excited to be having that conversation with you all. If you're not already familiar with the Arc of Northern Virginia, we've been around based in Fairfax and covering the whole Northern Virginia area for just over 60 years. We do a lot of advocacy. So we did a lot of work to make sure those new waivers that are coming out were funded and working on new waiver reimbursement rates and services, but all kinds of other things that are important to the DD community too. We do lots of free webinars and workshops like the one that we're doing here and answer very many questions every single day from people who are trying to get help, navigate an appeal, figure out what there is out there, what to do with a new diagnosis, all those kinds of things. So feel free to ask any questions about this session today in the Q&A, but absolutely follow up with me if you have questions on any other topic, and we'd love to help. We have a team on our staff that is contracted by Fairfax County and other CSBs to do case management. So they work directly with families who are using these waivers on a day-to-day basis. We also have a team who are public guardians for individuals who don't have anybody else to serve in that role but need someone. We have a special needs trust that can help people with disabilities save money while staying eligible for programs like Medicaid and Medicaid Waiver, Social Security, etc. And our hippest team is called Tech for Independent Living, and they customize apps on your phone or smart device for people with disabilities to help them learn all manner of things, daily living skills, lessons, how to travel, train, how to be more independent or safer, how to be more successful at work, all kinds of things. And like I said, it can be completely customized to that person's workplace and videos from their boss and their work checklists. It's really cool stuff, and it's all free. So I'll go ahead and keep us on rolling here. My slides don't seem to move. There we are. So today we're going to talk about what to expect while you're waiting on that waiver. You know, what kind of calls are you going to be getting? What paperwork should you be pulling together? And what does it sound like when you are offered a waiver and formally go through the process of accepting it and trying to get things going, especially if you maybe already have another waiver. We have about a third of our waiting list at any time has another program in play called the CCC Plus Medicaid Waiver, and we'll talk about that transition. And we'll do a little bit of a sneak peek about, as you're getting that waiver started, the kinds of services and options that you can access and how you'll make sure you get those up and running, because without a service provider, right, the waiver is not really a whole lot of help. And then we'll talk about how you can reach out to the Arc of Northern Virginia at any time. So while you are waiting, remember that your Community Services Board is your point of contact. That's the agency where you apply to be put on the waiting list. They're the folks that keep track of everyone on that waiting list. Because of the way our budget got passed this year in 2024, it covers the next 2 years. And it essentially says of the waiver slots, 3,440 of them are going to be divided into 8 chunks. And a chunk is going to go out each quarter for the next 2 years. So on a pretty ongoing basis, we're going to be hearing about people being offered a waiver slot and then people proceeding with accepting services. If you are someone who may get a slot, the Community Services Board is going to contact you. They're going to say, hey, you're being considered for a slot. We're filling out a form so that the folks who make recommendations on who actually gets to receive a waiver have your most up-to-date information. And I don't just mean contact information. They're not looking at people's names and addresses. What I mean is, do they really truly understand the need? Right? Do they understand how dire the situation in his home, the services the person with the disability really needs on the waiver, the whole family dynamic, and how that's playing into how important it is for this person to receive services. So that's a really important time to be frank with them and share what's going well and what's not, and why you all need help, and how the waiver in particular can help. right? So we don't want to just say things like, I'm just really overwhelmed and struggling, because, oh my goodness, I hear you. And we are overwhelmed and struggling, but something more specific like, because I am worried I'm going to have to quit my job. My child needs a caregiver after school. They've aged out of after school childcare, and I can't afford another option. A waiver, though, could pay for a care attendant then, and that's why we need one so much. So that's an example of how you can really closely tie the need and the family situation to what a waiver can offer for you. Of course, being told that you're being considered for a slot means just that. You're being considered. It doesn't necessarily mean you'll get one that time, but it is a really good sign. It means you're at the top of that urgent need waiting list. So at that time, you're going to want to make sure the Community Services Board knows, yes, we really want this waiver, or perhaps not. You know, every once in a while, we put someone on a waiting list years prior, and the moment that a slot might be offered to us, we realize grandma in Germany is sick, and we're going to spend the next 6 months going to live and take care of her. It's not a good time for us to take a waiver, for example. Or other life situations mean, you know, or we know that at the end of the school year, we're going to move out of state. We're getting a military transfer, whatever that looks like. So definitely notify them early, as soon as possible, if you would no longer want or be able to take a waiver permanently or right now, right? If you knew that there were some services you would need immediately, it's going to be residential support 24/7. This person is ready to leave home and they need a high level of care. You want to share all of those kinds of things, right? They need a really full picture of what's going on and what you need and when. And then a waiver slot assignment committee, without looking at names or identifying information, makes recommendations on who's going to get those waiver slots. And again, keep in mind, these are going out every single quarter for the next 2 years. So there's going to be lots of these discussions and meetings going on. So if you're not offered a waiver slot right away, you got 7 more chances, right? 7 more quarters for that to happen, right? If you are over 18, or the person with the disability is over 18 who's on the waiting list, it's a great idea to go ahead and apply for Medicaid, even if they don't yet have the waiver, and Social Security benefits. For what it's worth, we usually say once the adult with disabilities reaches their 18th birthday that month, they turn 18, it's a great time to apply for Social Security. Social Security provides monthly cash income designed to pay for living expenses. Rent, food, utilities, transportation, you know, all living expenses, the same kind of bills we're all paying all day, every day as adults. That Social Security process can take a number of months. It's just a big bureaucracy, right? So starting that as soon as the person turns 18 is a great idea. And as soon as the person receives their first Social Security payment check, and you'd be notified that's going to happen. In Virginia, they're automatically eligible for Medicaid then. Medicaid uses Social Security's determination that they've got a disability and they're eligible, but you still have to fill out and submit the Medicaid paperwork. And it's a big part of being ready for a waiver, because at the point at which you get offered a waiver, if you're over 18, you're going to have that Social Security and Medicaid already in place. If you're under 18, you'll be able to apply for Medicaid then under special waiver rules, because maybe you wouldn't be eligible early otherwise. But if you're over 18, already getting started with that Social Security and Medicaid process is a great way to make sure that once the waiver is offered, you can really go pretty quickly with receiving and accepting services. So let's talk about what that offer and acceptance would look like. So if you are going to be getting a waiver, your Community Services Board is going to call you and they're going to say what type of waiver you're being offered, right? Is it a family and individual supports waiver that can fund 24/7 staff? It can work if the person's a child and is in the family home. It can work if they're an adult and they want to live semi-independently. It can work if they're an adult and need a live-in aid and want supports brought to their apartment. Or do they need a community living waiver, which is the waiver that would fund a 24/7 group home or other kind of licensed big deal residential services like sponsored residential would be the other one. So really both waivers are very similar in what they offer, but you want to make sure you understand what you're being offered, just so you kind of have your mind wrapped around that and are ready to go with it. And then right away, you should be talking with the Community Services Board saying, okay, yes, I want this waiver. Yes, I'll fill out the paperwork with you. If you get services now waiver or non-waiver services from someone, it's a good idea to talk to them and say, hey, I'm going to get funding through this new program. Do you work with them too? Can I continue working with you? Or looks like you don't. We may have to stop services and find a new provider. It's just things to keep in mind and to get yourself ready for. And like we talked about, you are going to now apply for Medicaid. Ideally, if the person's with a disability is over 18, they would already have it. And same with Social Security. But if they're under 18 and didn't have that Medicaid in place yet because they weren't an adult and their whole family income didn't make them eligible, or they're over 18 and they hadn't done it yet, you're going to have to apply. And I'm going to share a follow-up when I do the follow-up reminder from this email that you can also find on our website with a tip on filling out that Medicaid application. It can be tricky to know what to put where. In short, the person with the disability is the applicant. And as parents, that can feel awkward because it will ask about who's the head of household. And in many senses, if the person with the disability is living at home with family, we may not think of them traditionally as the head of household, but for the purposes of that application, they are, right? They really are either an adult and they're applying on their own, or they're a child and they're applying under special rules because they're getting a waiver. And so waivers kind of looking at them as a household of one, if you will, inside a larger household. We want to make sure that that gets done well. I do want to note here briefly that right before the pandemic, some new rules started being implementing saying, if you are under 18 and have Medicaid, which is not super common in the waiting list population. It either happens if the person has the CCC Plus waiver already, a different kind of waiver, or if the whole family is relatively low income, maybe the student's receiving free and reduced lunch, that's a good marker for it. There's a disability determination to move that person from child Medicaid to adult Medicaid. If you were getting offered a waiver for the first time and your child is already 17 plus years old, make sure that as you're talking with the Community Services Board, as you're talking with the people when you're applying for Medicaid, they know that they're making sure that person is ready to make that leap from 17-year-old Medicaid to flipping the switch on their 18th birthday. There's just some separate paperwork you'll need to fill out. So it's just something to keep in the back of your mind. And again, I'll send handouts on that are like 1 and 2 pages long. But as we start thinking about how we prepare ourselves, these are things we want in the back of our mind. Oh, I know. At whatever point, if my child's getting Medicaid when they're 17 or younger, we're going to have to do some little extra paperwork right before they turn 18, just to make sure they're ready and they keep their waiver in place. We've alluded to this a little bit, but as a reminder, there are 3 types of Medicaid waivers, and overwhelmingly, they are very similar. They have the same application process. They have the same waiting list with the Community Services Board. They offer a lot of identical services, but there are some subtle differences. Like we talked about, that community living waiver offers 24/7 residential support, if that's what the person with the disability needs. There are relatively few of those waivers available because other waivers that are more affordable for the state to offer are able to serve the majority of people. But if you're talking about someone in your family who immediately is going to need 24/7 residential support away from the family home, that's an important thing for the Community Services Board to understand. That may be someone who really truly needs a community living waiver. It's for people with usually the highest level of support need. Then there's the family and individual supports waiver. And I would say, goodness, I can't do the math off the top of my head, but let's say roughly 80% of the waivers that are coming out in the next 2 years fall into this category. This works for everyone from you need a couple of hours of drop-in support a day to you're an adult, you're a child, you need some respite, you need a little bit of regular care, maybe you even need a live-in aid. All of those kinds of things can work here. This really covers everything the community living waiver does, except for a very few 24/7 wraparound residential services. There's also a building independence waiver. We don't talk about it a whole lot, but we should know about it. It's for adults over 18, ready to live outside the family home, who need not very much ongoing support. Maybe we could have remote support and monitoring. Maybe we have a staff person there every other day checking on them to do meal planning and, a deep clean of the house and open the mail, pay the bills kinds of things. But for a lot of time, this person could be safe and fairly independent or at a job or otherwise getting services and supports. There's not a waiting list for that right now. So if you're hearing this and thinking, we may be ready to go with that option, that seems like a good match for us. It's a good time to talk to your community services board and say you'd be willing to look at a building independence waiver too. Because all these waivers that are coming out in the next 2 years are either community living or family and individual supports waivers because there are already building independence waivers available. So here are some places where we see people get stuck on this path from waiting list to actively using a waiver. Like we talked about, that Medicaid application, there are some tricky things. The person with a disability is the head of household. You will get a paper letter when you receive a waiver that clarifies this person is eligible for Medicaid under special rules. And frankly, if you apply for Medicaid, just like health insurance, without a waiver, the rules are pretty stringent. If you apply with a waiver, the rules say, oh, we'll only look at the income and the assets of the person with a disability, even if they're a child. We won't count the rest of the house. And if they're an adult, they're allowed to make way more than your average Medicaid user. So you'll want to make sure that when you're turning in your Medicaid application, you're also turning in that letter showing, make sure you evaluate me with the special rules that are more flexible, that will make sure I'm able to get approved for this Medicaid. Fairfax County Community Services Board has a whole benefits division, and they and your support coordinator can help you talk you through some of these things that may get tricky or feel awkward to fill out. If you're stuck or overwhelmed by it, don't hesitate to ask. Absolutely. One of the things we tell families often is on that Medicaid application, you are better off filling out everything instead of leaving blanks and doing your very, very best. And the Medicaid long-term care workers who process those applications are very good at disregarding the extra. But what we don't want to do is fill out an application halfway or say, I don't think this section applies. I'm not even going to try and fill anything out. And then it takes weeks for that eligibility worker to look at the application. Then they see this hole. Then they reach out to you. Then it takes days for you to get information back to them and days to get back in their queue. It really, really slows things down. So do your best work filling it out, ask questions. Don't panic if there's a mistake. I don't mean to say that it won't end up fine in the end. I more so mean to say it just slows things down disproportionately. So we'll do our best first effort. We get asked a lot, if the person has a special needs trust or an ABLE account, do I have to write in about that? You do. You'll write in showing that the person has that account. You'll give them a copy of a recent account statement. And usually they also want to see a copy of the account agreement when you just set it up. And they're doing all of that because even though special needs trust and ABLE accounts don't count as assets, when you're applying to programs like Medicaid, they check to make sure, are you using your ABLE account and special needs trust correctly? Is it written correctly? Is the balance in there, which this only applies to ABLE accounts, appropriate? Those kinds of things that they're looking at to make sure that, yep, I really truly do disregard this account, but I don't know if I can disregard it until I check all those boxes to make sure it was written and is being used correctly. If you are a Northern Virginia resident, Arlington, Fairfax, and Falls Church and Alexandria City CSBs have historically funded the graduates of their public schools who need day and employment services but don't yet have a waiver. That's often called local funding. So if you or your loved one with a disability graduated from public schools in the area, and then you started meeting with the Community Services Board just to get some funds and supports for daytime employment services or a day program or another option called self-directed services, that's all going to be changing now, right? You got those services in that way with those dollars because you didn't have a waiver. So if you are currently attending a day or employment support program, and let's use Fairfax as an example, Fairfax County is paying for that with local dollars, then it's probably just going to be a matter of saying, hey, can the waiver start paying for this program? This program accepts waiver and they accept local dollars. Sure, and the transition is really on paperwork and it should feel fairly seamless. If you receive Self-directed services, and that term should be familiar if you do, that would be for people who graduate, but instead of going to a traditional day or employment style program, they really use funds to create their own program. They hire an attendant who helps them do volunteer work. They go to Spark, they go to Cameron's Chocolates, they go to McLean Bible's ADDP program, right? They've used it for program fees and other kinds of things that are not usually waiver programs. In the case of accepting a waiver, the person is no longer eligible for those self-directed services dollars. So they're going to have to look at, okay, now that I have different kinds of dollars to spend, waiver dollars to spend, what are my choices and what can I create that's really similar to self-directed services if that was a great model for me? Or if I was finding that it was no longer a good fit, what are some waiver day and employment options I can explore instead? If you are someone who currently has a CCC Plus waiver, that's the waiver for people who have significant medical needs in addition to a disability, overwhelmingly, the service used on that waiver is a one-to-one caregiver. Sometimes it's a nurse. Generally speaking, the agencies or care providers that work under that waiver also work under the DD waiver. So double check, ask them for sure, especially if you want to keep them. And then you'll just, again, kind of like a paperwork change. You'll just say, instead of billing this waiver for my services every month, we're going to keep things the same, but bill this other waiver, right? Or it can be a time to talk about, actually, I need more caregiver hours or less caregiver hours, or I want to move to a different provider. Absolutely, you can do all of those things. So if you're moving from a CCC Plus waiver, you can keep things pretty similar or the same to how they are now, if it suits you in a lot of cases, or talk about changing it. If you know that the person with a disability is safe where they live now, but let's say in a couple of years, they're going to need residential services. Let's say I know in 2 years, my husband and I are retiring. We're moving across the country. This is not true, of course. It sounds nice, though. And our son is suddenly going to need residential services. It's a good thing to start thinking about, right? And to making sure that the Community Services Board knows. We can now accept a waiver that doesn't have residential services like that kind because it's not what we need. But I do want to put on your radar, we're going to need it at this time in the future, right? Good kinds of things to share. And now let's get into a little bit of the nitty-gritty of how we get services actually up and going. So like we talked about, the person's going to need Medicaid. Either they already have it and they're converting it to waiver Medicaid, or they're applying for the first time. You're going to meet with your Community Services Board support coordinator. They used to be called case managers, and that's a term that I feel like is familiar with a lot of us. But support coordinator is such an apt description because they're sort of the keystone service. They're the hub that connects you to all of the supports and services within waiver and even without. So let's say the person says, I want to use my waiver caregiver to go do a volunteer option that has nothing to do with the waiver at all. Maybe that support coordinator helps research and find some volunteer options that you could explore, right? So you're going to sit down and come up with a big plan of, this is what I need, this is what I want. Let's start talking through how to make it a reality. If you have a school-aged child or did in the past, it feels, in my mind, a lot like an IEP that you made in school, right? What are the goals for this person? What are their needs? And then how do we get those things accomplished? Then you'll start selecting service providers. So let's say you wanted a service where a caregiver came into your own home. You choose who that caregiver was going to be, or an agency that was going to staff that need, and you'd start working with them. Or if you wanted a day or employment provider, you'd start go touring them, right? Your support coordinator can help you with all these kinds of things, right? Setting up the tours, attending with you, talking through, oh, does it seem like a good fit or not? Here's a pro and a con for this, those kinds of things. And this is another area where we have a handout on how to, as a parent or as a person with a disability, figure out if someone's a good provider fit for you. We're happy to share that. And then let's say you go see that provider, you think, this is who I want. The provider says, you're who I want. Right, we're a great pair. Then the support coordinator's job becomes getting those services authorized, saying, okay, this person and this provider want to work together. I'm going to put in the paperwork and ask that that partnership, that service be funded. And as you can imagine, getting the Medicaid in place, having these meetings, touring and considering providers, finally choosing someone, getting these plans submitted can take some time. Waiver services are meant to be started pretty quickly, within 2 months or so of being offered that waiver. The ideal would be that someone would be up and getting services. It's not unusual for it to take longer than that. I just don't want people to panic. The support coordinator's job then becomes putting in a request saying, there's a reason we're having a little bit of a delay in startup. The family had trouble getting the documents for their Medicaid application, or the service provider they really want to tour is out of town and they're booked up for the next couple of weeks, whatever that looks like. So we'll just all be keeping an eye on making sure this process goes as quickly as possible. But if you get snagged, making sure that you get some extra time allowed to get things started. That's especially important. I'll go back to that real quickly. Let's say you have a loved one who's in a significant crisis right now and they're in a mental health residential treatment facility. They're at an out-of-state or out-of-area residential school, and you need some time to readjust things and get them back here or get them discharged. That's a good time to be sharing those sorts of things too. Okay, I'm not going to go into a ton of depth on the services the waivers offer, because once you get a waiver, these are exactly the kinds of things you're going to be talking about with your support coordinator in a lot of depth. But as a high-level overview, as we talk about residential services, all three of the types of the DD waiver offer some version of residential services. The building independence waiver, like I mentioned, really is for adults who need pretty few hours of residential services, meaning in their home, meaning they're living away from parents, but between their work and family and friends and their own skills and maybe remote monitoring or whatever else we have going on, maybe they just need a little bit of dropping in. Maybe they have a caregiver who's there a couple of hours a day for some companionship. Onto the family and individual supports waiver in the middle column that can offer a live-in caregiver kind of option or a supported living option, where maybe there's staff there 24 hours a day. Maybe they're living with 1 or 2 people with disabilities. This is a service that's in high demand, but is hard to get, but important if you want a service like this to note it, because that's what encourages providers to develop that service, right? We're not going to build what people aren't asking for. And then on the community living waiver side, there's the very traditional group home model. A lot of people that don't, generally speaking, know each other or necessarily even have a ton in common are living in a shared home with shared staff. There's also a live-in aid model here and a sponsored residential model where the person with the disability would live in the home of a caregiver, usually. Maybe it's a special ed teacher who wants to do a second career, or it's someone who used to work in other kinds of residential services for people with disabilities and is happy to have someone with disabilities live in their home. That's an option under the community living waiver. Beyond that, you can see really all three of the waivers offer the full array of day and employment work time options. So if you have a school-aged child, the residential pieces are sort of irrelevant, right? The school-aged children are living at home with family. If you have a school-aged child or you're looking at graduation and beyond, in those situations, these three waivers are really identical. They all offer the same kind of day and employment options at the same reimbursement rate with the same providers. So for day and employment services, any waiver you have will really get you where you're going. For in-home services, which I'll say to mean the person with a disability could be living with family, could be living with friends, could be living with roommates, but they're not living in a group home or another situation where their staff always packaged into the residence. The family and individual supports waiver, those are the ones that almost everyone will be offered in these next 2 years, and the community living waiver offer a one-to-one caregiver. They can be there for skill building and charting goals. They can be there for companionship. They can be there on a regular basis. On top of that, they can be there for respite and extra hours of care. And all three of our DD waivers offer up to $5,000 a year to make changes to the home where the person with the disability is living. So wider doorways or ramps, lower toilets. We've seen people have who elope, who escape the home, often have keypad locks on the inside of the door so that you can't just turn the knob and run out. You have to type in a code first to either slow them down or alert a family person. All kinds of cool stuff that can be done, again, under all of the waivers. And all of the waivers also offer electronic home-based support, which is the coolest stuff if someone with a disability is over 18, maybe going to be living away from families. It's pill systems that will, at the right day and time, pop open and beep until the person takes the medication out and takes the medication. Or it can be a button that you push on a screen and a caregiver pops up and says, hey, what's wrong? You feeling anxious? Or did you burn your dinner? Or is a weird person at the door? Let's troubleshoot together. Because maybe that person with a disability is doing well and thriving and prefers to be alone a fair amount of the time, but needs a knowledge and skilled person essentially on call to help talk them through things. This program can come with remote monitoring and supports. We can see if the person with the disability is getting up overnight and roaming, if they ever got into the shower that week, whatever it is, right? All three of the waivers come with up to $5,000 a year in portable technology, in crisis services, and can offer some fairly limited reimbursement for transportation if a family member or friend is having to drive that person to a lot of activities that may be outlined in the plan they have with their waiver. The waivers that are going out in the next 2 years, the Family and Individual Supports and Community Living Waiver, both offer nursing. And of course, that's on an as needed basis, whether or not the person needs a nurse at all, needs a nurse as their regular caregiver, needs a high-level nurse who does case management and just stops in and checks on things, those sorts of things. So as you're thinking about accepting a waiver, I want people to really understand that Family and Individual Supports and Community Living Waiver are very, very close to being identical, with the exception of the fact the community living waiver offers more 24/7 awake, heavy-duty traditional residential services, but otherwise very, very similar. And it would only make sense to be offered and receive that waiver if that person was ready to move like now. That wouldn't be something we would hold for the future. One important thing to think about with the waiver is if you hire a caregiver, a one-to-one caregiver, which is the most common waiver service, you have two choices. You can hire an agency. Let's make Lucy Beadnell's home care agency, which doesn't exist. And then you'd meet with that agency and you'd say, here are the things you should know about my child or myself. Here's when I need help. Here's what that looks like. Here's the skills I want this person to have. And the agency's job is to do their best to find someone who's a good fit for the hours you need help and the needs you have, and send that person. And if they call out, to send backup staff. The agency is responsible for the great majority of the paperwork, which is really nice, but the family gets a lot less control over who the particular attendants are, the training they get, those kinds of things. The other option is called consumer-directed or CD services. And in this case, the waiver user or their family, whoever's helping them, can hire an adult sibling, a friend down the street, a college student who lives nearby. They can place an ad. It can be someone they know already and say, this is exactly the person I want working with my loved one or working with me. They have the right skills and the right attitude. I'm willing to train them on anything they don't know, and I'm willing to sign off on their timesheets. And in those cases, you'll work with separate agencies who are like HR departments, right? They'll process payroll. They'll make sure the person fills out their new hire paperwork. They'll make sure all those kinds of logistical things get done. And so it is a fair amount of work for the family, both making sure other folks are doing what they're supposed to be doing and the family on their own filling out paperwork. But you do get a lot of control over who is hired. And some people do a mix. So maybe there's days, Monday through Friday, when the parents just cannot be home to greet the child off the school bus, and they need a very consistent set of caregivers who can be there from 2:30 in the afternoon to 8 at night, Monday through Friday, making this up. Great. Maybe on the weekends or Friday evenings too, this family is always going to be around, but it would be great to have a caregiver there who had a shared interest in art or Star Wars or Legos or chess or whatever it was that the person with a disability loved, so that they could be there, knowing it's consumer directed. The family may not have a ton of backups. If that person calls out, we're okay. We can still, as a family, provide care that's needed for that person, right? So that's just an example of how it can work. And over time, you can change it. That's the case with pretty much all waiver services. If you try one avenue, one provider, one service, and it's not a good fit, you'd go back to your support coordinator and say, it's not a good fit. Let's look again at some other choices for me. I know a little bit more. I want to note here, from having been a support coordinator many years ago, it's important for families to understand waiting with a waiver is very hard work. and lonely. Receiving a waiver is also very hard work. It's just a different kind of work. There are people in your home. If your adult with a disability or child with a disability is still living with you and they're bringing caregivers into the home, it can feel, depending upon your family's dynamic and culture, awkward, especially at first to have a new person or many new people coming into the home to provide that care. Because if you are eating as a family, if you are arguing or watching a show or going on an activity as a family, you'll need to figure out what goes on with this other person. Do they eat with us? Do they like that? Do they want a break then? You know, how do those dynamics play out? And do I feel comfortable having another person in my home, you know, suiting with my personality and my lifestyle? You're also going to be talking monthly with your support coordinator. And on top of that, having an in-person visit with them at least every quarter, often monthly when you're getting services started, or monthly if you're going through a crisis. So that would be another person who's coming into your home, filling out paperwork, checking in on things, you know, talking with you all. If you choose consumer-directed services where you choose the caregivers that come into the home, there's another person called the service facilitator, kind of like that HR department I mentioned, who will come and do visits, sometimes monthly, but no more or no less frequently than quarterly, right? So now we've talked about, we've got caregivers in our home, we've got support coordinators in our home, we've got service facilitators in our home. That's a lot. On top of that, there's paperwork, right? And if you've ever had a public benefit before, Medicaid or Social Security, you know the paperwork really does have to be done, and it really does have to be done on time. Absolutely, you can reach out to the ARC of Northern Virginia or the benefits planning team at the Community Services Board or your support coordinator to get help. You know, I don't understand what this question's asking, but it really is incumbent upon the person receiving the waiver and their family to make sure that paperwork is done and turned in and completed correctly, and that things are going on in place, because they're the only people who really have all of the information that goes into that paperwork. Again, you can get help, but you want to make sure that those things are happening. And as you're starting up with new providers, if you're looking at out-of-home providers, it's work going on tours. And those providers, especially day and employment providers, are usually open during regular weekday hours during the weekday. So that could mean time off from work or other kinds of things to go through those visits. As you're working on using the waiver, you may be up and ready for things, and then you may hit a snag where an authorization hasn't come through yet, or a staff member quit, or all those kinds of things, right? And we scramble and we redo things. And every year you will redo paperwork to show that you continue to be eligible for waiver. Every year, the VIDES assessment that you did when you first applied for the waiver is redone. A lot of questions about how much help the person needs each day and what that helps for. I would say that takes, 45 minutes or so. Every 2 years for children, every 3 years for an adult, there's a separate assessment called the CIS that can take hours to complete and is a really in-depth look at needs and caregiving. And of course, on top of that, annual plans. So I don't say all of this to overwhelm you. Like anything else, IEPs or mortgages or jobs or anything else, right? Once you get into the flow of it, it makes sense. You can do it in a way that makes sense for your family. People will help you. You've got your last year's paperwork saved, right? You got your binder together. You're whipping through things. You know what to expect and when, but it can feel really overwhelming. And I just don't want people to be caught off guard by that or feel like no one's going to help. It's always going to be like this. People will help. You will get into a flow, right? And just like if you were starting any new program or service, there's usually a lot more upfront work than there is on an ongoing basis. But just make sure you're being responsive to all the players on your team. They're all trying to do their job to help you, and we can be a lot more efficient when we're all doing our best and working together. Keep in mind, you will have a specific support coordinator, a man or woman who works directly with you on a very regular basis, unless they were out on leave or whatever. But you can always call the main number at your community services board, and those are on the screen. And a mainline email in Fairfax County is on the screen too, to make sure that you are, if you've got a question, right? I'm stuck, I need help, who's my person, how I'm going to get through this, those kinds of things, they are absolutely there to help. And keep in mind, support coordinators are overwhelmingly people with degrees in areas like social work and psychology and development and all those kinds of things, right? They are people who are by nature compassionate and caregiving. Sometimes they're new at their job too. So we want to grant everybody a little bit of grace and be kind, but they're there because they want to help you, right? They chose a job as a helper, right? These are the folks who will tell you if you've got a slot, will help you set up your services, help you set up meetings, help you set up tours. They're your main point of contact, kind of like a Sherpa to get you through all of this waiver paperwork, and they'll be there with you even after things are up and going. They'll still be the same person who checks on you monthly to check in, quarterly maybe to visit at the house, those kinds of things. Hopefully you'll be able to get a really good relationship going with that person. I'll put my contact information here up on the screen. You can send me an email at that address, but also if you go to the arcofnova.org, up in the top right of the screen is a little orange box that says I need help. You can put questions there anytime. Or you can, if you want the shortcut, it's the arcofnova.org/answers. And any of those questions come exclusively to me, unless it's I won't be having any more children unless it's a weird time when I'm out of the office, which is pretty rare. So you can reach out to me. You can encourage other people to reach out to me. We're always happy to answer questions for families for free. And I'm going to go ahead and turn to our Q&A now. If you have questions still, this is a great time to type them in, and we'll use all of our time here to make sure we get those answered as quickly as possible. Oh, great one. Which of the waivers did I say was relatively rare and hard to get? Good question. And I'm going to go back here on our screen so we can look at it. It is the community living waiver, that waiver that would offer the 24/7 heavy duty residential kind of out of home, group homes, sponsored residential sort of providers, because there aren't that many people who need that level of service, especially not immediately, right? And so a lot of people say, oh, but I think my child may want that in 5 or 10 years. Should I take a waiver now? Yep. My advice is always take the waiver that is offered to you and try and use it, because it's a lot easier to, let's say, get all the paperwork done, because it's the same for all the waivers, tour the provider, start working with your team, try that for 6 months. And if the services that the waiver you got offered isn't a fit, and you've really done your best, it's much easier then to go back to the Community Services Board team and say, you know what? We tried it. It didn't work. It looks like we may need a different kind of waiver. It's much easier to make that transition. You've already got all the wheels in motion. We're adding in a couple of extra things than it is to go back on the waiting list and wait for goodness knows how long to get another waiver slot. And I will say, in a time where waiver slots, a lot are being offered, but still there's a lot of competition for them. If a family turns down a waiver slot saying, I'd rather have nothing, that doesn't seem quite right to me. It does, in my opinion, send a little bit of a message that maybe getting that waiver is not the top priority, and it may be harder to get offered a waiver in the future. So in a quick recap, I would say, take the waiver slot that's offered. A lot of the services are the same. Do your very, very best to make it work. If it doesn't, go back and say, hey, this doesn't work. We need to transfer to something else. And that process is usually fairly short, a couple of months, I'll say. Under consumer-directed services, those are the waiver services we talked about where you've got a caregiver in your home. Let's see if I can get to the right place. But you choose who they are. Can the individual hired live in the home? I was previously informed they could not, although they could be a family member or friend. Yes, it is possible to have a consumer-directed attendant live in the home. So let's think of, when I see that a lot is if, I'm making these ages up, the person with a disability is 17, their sibling is 22 and has recently graduated from college, is going to be home for 6 months or for a year, and they'd be happy to be a caregiver and they know their sibling really well. Yep, they're living in the same home. That person could be a caregiver. So yep, that's theoretically possible. A lot of consumer-directed aides don't live in the home, as you can imagine, just like a lot of the caregivers in the world don't necessarily live with us, but it can be done. Is there a reasonably up-to-date list of waiting lists by CSB? Sure, I'm happy to send one out. I mean, keep in mind that waiting lists can look very different in one county versus another, because one county has a higher or lower population, and waiver slots are distributed based upon population. So generally speaking, it shouldn't be advantageous to live in one part of a state versus another in terms of getting a slot more quickly, because it's all done by population and rough percentages. But yes, I'm happy to send that list out when I do a recap from this webinar. Do we provide help to families in Prince William County? There's an ARC of Greater Prince William. I worked there for a little bit of a while, and they're wonderful. They're a different kind of ARC than we are. They are a big service provider. They provide residential housing. My goodness, they have 20 homes, a day and employment provider. They have child care centers, right? Whereas our ARC does a lot more things like this, advocacy, answering questions. So yes, I am happy to talk to families in Prince William County. I get questions from people all over the state all day, every day. I'm never not going to answer someone's question, but I may also gently suggest, hey, there's an ARC near you, and you may want to check in with them too. We all have the same mission, though we operate a little bit differently. Is there a difference between the Medicaid I have now and the Medicaid on the waiver? That's a great question. No, Medicaid means the Medicaid health insurance. The difference with a Medicaid waiver is the Medicaid application team behind the scenes says they used to be able to use their Medicaid just on health insurance, doctors, pharmacies, prescriptions, blah, blah, blah. Now their Medicaid is waiver Medicaid. So in addition to paying for those same healthcare things at the same rate, the same places, they can also use it to buy these waiver services like caregivers, like employment supports, like live-in aids, all those other kinds of things. So the health insurance side of it is the same. It's just that Medicaid waiver offers a lot more on top of the health insurance. What residential options are rare and hard to get? Oh yeah, so we did talk through that a little bit. So I will say I worked in group homes like 16 years ago when I started working at an ARC. And it's a model that works for a lot of people. I'm seeing families look toward it a lot less, right? And for reasons that I think we can understand sort of instinctively, that if you told anyone in your family that they were going to move into a big home with a bunch of roommates they didn't choose and helpers they didn't choose, that can be really difficult to navigate in terms of personalities, making sure everyone gets the attention they need. We're seeing lots more people do customized things. Maybe the person with a disability lives in an apartment with a live-in aid. They have additional aids on top of that. They go to an employment program during the day. Lots of options that are much more tailor-suited to the person. Yep, the slides will be sent out along with the handouts that I mentioned. Absolutely. All right, so on a previous webinar, the waiting list numbers in Fairfax County showed, so the person is really asking a question about, so waiver slots do go out proportionately by area, population, and need. And so like I said, there really should not be an advantage living in one area over another. I will also note that service provider options in Fairfax County are a lot more numerous than in other parts of the state. So maybe by luck, in another part of the state, you'd get offered a waiver half a year sooner, but there's one employment provider in the whole area. And if you don't like them or they're too far away in your 70-mile wide county, you just don't really have anyone to work with. So I'll say all things, there's give and take and there's pros and cons, but there should not be a disadvantage to living in Fairfax in terms of being on the waiting list. I have a child on the priority 1 waiting list. So those are the folks we expect to get served, right? Most urgently in need. And he already has the CCC Plus waiver, I believe is what that means. He's in school for the next 2 years. Will he be eligible for receiving a DD waiver in the next 2 years? Oh, yes, he is. Absolutely, he can. One of your best advocacy tools as a parent would be showing what's the gap between what school offers, what CCC Plus waiver offers, and what he would really benefit from DD waiver, right? What is missing that the DD waiver could add on? And helping the Community Services Board really understand that connection is a great way to help ensure he gets a waiver more quickly. But with the funding that came out, the intention is for everyone on the priority 1 waiting list to get help in the next 2 years. I can't speak to, because no one can speak to, how many more people are going to enter on the priority 1 waiting list in the next 2 years. So it's going to be a little bit of a numbers game and jockeying to see how that all plays out. But no, just by virtue of being school age and having a CCC Plus waiver doesn't mean he's going to get skipped and wouldn't get offered services. You just want to show the services that you need still. Oh, what constitutes using an ABLE account correctly? So ABLE accounts are a savings tool that allow people with disabilities to save money while still be eligible for programs like Medicaid and waiver, etc. ABLE account money is supposed to be used on disability-related expenses for the person with a disability, but there's not someone who will check in with you every month to make sure that's the case. So here's an example. The person with a disability buys a Ferrari for their girlfriend. That would not be an appropriate use of ABLE account funds or disability-related expenses. That's what the folks at the Medicaid application office are looking for. Is there something that's really glaringly odd that's not what this money is meant to be used for? And to be clear, ABLE accounts and special needs trusts are very broad in the parameters, but it really is meant to be a benefit for the person with a disability, not extravagant gifts for others and not something that's remotely not disability related. I just wanted, I don't know, a $4,000 dining room table that's not adapted, right? Those kinds of things might raise some red flags. You can have consumer and agency directed. How does that work? Oh, just like it does, you say, I'll use a person as an example. Let's say James has 40 hours of care a week. He chooses that an agency staffs 20 of them, and those are these hours, Monday through Thursday, 4 to 8 p.m. or 4 to 9 p.m., right? But consumer directed, James's brother, neighbor, person they found on Craigslist or Facebook or whatever, does the hours, the other 20 hours, and they do 8 hours Saturday, 8 hours Sunday, and some hours on Friday evening. That's an example of how that could work. It does mean you're doing double the paperwork and double the meetings, right? Because you're having meetings and filling things out with consumer-directed paperwork. You'd still be meeting and filling paperwork out with the agency. But even with that added workload, for some people, it's just a good balance. Are psychological evaluations and developmental pediatric evaluations held in the same regard, or should a family seek one over the other? I'm assuming this is in discussion in reference to eligibility for waivers. That really is the only time when you're first applying for a waiver, when the Community Services Board is going to say, I need a current, which usually psychological evaluation. I have to say the Fairfax CSB, Arlington, Alexandria have done a tremendous job in recent years at looking at whatever documentation a family has and seeing if it's enough. So I almost never tell a family, unless they've got zero, to go out and get new documentation. If they've got something, give whatever you have to the Community Services Board and see if it's appropriate for them. And to be clear, once the person has a waiver and you're selecting your residential or your employment or your in-home provider, those kinds of evaluations aren't really needing to be updated and taken into account for those sorts of things. This is really just when you're showing eligibility for the waiver when you're first applying. Does the Medicaid waiver program have different income and asset limits compared to traditional Medicaid? Yes. And that's why it's so important to share that letter that I talked about. I'm going to take these slides down. That shows this person is getting waiver Medicaid. Waiver Medicaid is also sometimes called long-term care or LTC Medicaid, right? Caregivers. And the income rules are much more flexible for Medicaid waiver users than they are for your average individual off the street who need Medicaid health insurance. The asset limit is the same, meaning that at the end of every month, the person with a waiver can't have more than $2,000 in countable assets. That would be if we combined a checking account and a savings account and stocks in their name or all those kinds of things. But like we talked about, ABLE accounts and special needs trust don't count. So it is possible to save money. Asset limits are the same. Income limits are much more flexible for Medicaid waiver users than they are for individuals applying for just regular Medicaid. Is there a list of service providers that I can look at? Sure, it depends upon what service you're thinking about. At the arcofnova.org, if you hover over programs, you can drop down to a program called Transition Points. And Transition Points is really a big series of guidebooks and information for various stages of life. So there's a Transition Points guide on housing that lists a whole bunch of residential and housing providers. There's a Transition Points guide on employment that lists a whole bunch of employment providers. There are lists of agencies, if you just wanted a regular standard caregiver to come to your house, that are goodness, pages and pages and pages long. So yes, there are lots and lots of lists of providers, but for DD waiver specific providers, usually residential employment, those kinds of things, those are in our big transition points guides. Those are updated every few years. So there may be a provider not in there yet. On our website, we have a provider directory. Some providers enter themselves there. Sometimes providers do presentations before the Community Services Board, and they'll know about new and upcoming providers. So there's lots of ways to look at it. Yep, the slides will be sent out. Does Medicaid cover an outpatient treatment program? So that would be looking at Medicaid through the health insurance side, not the waiver side. Waiver by definition is community-based, meaning living in the same settings other community members are. Outpatient, you did say. So that again would be Medicaid health insurance, not the waiver. So if the person needed outpatient treatment, they could absolutely use their Medicaid health insurance to look at that, but it wouldn't be a waiver service provider or waiver program, and probably not something your support coordinator would be involved with. I want a second just to read through this. Someone put in a question about, is there a carrier exploration waiver? And I'm not quite sure what that means. So if you have a moment to type in a few more details, I'd be happy to look at it. My child has a 529 and an ABLE account. Should I move funds from the 529 to the ABLE? Oh, so generally speaking, 529 plans, especially right around age 18, are not countable assets. So log into your 529 plan with Virginia 529 or whoever. So like for my kids' 529 plans, I can log in and see I am the account owner. I am the person who set it up. And so it's not an asset to the child. They don't own the account. They are only listed as the beneficiary of the account. And because they haven't yet received any funds, just having that 529 plan in and of itself usually doesn't cause any issues. So definitely log in. You should be able to see right now who's the account owner. And if it's you, it's not your child's asset. Right? If the child is going to be attending a post-secondary option and you plan to use that 529 plan, great. You can leave it where it is. Or if they're not, but another sibling is, you can roll it over to the other sibling. Or if you know what, we set this up when they were younger and my child has decided on a completely different path, and there's no way we're going to use these 529 plans in a traditional way, then it probably makes sense for other reasons to have that conversation about moving that money over, but not about waiver eligibility. A family that they're working for is asking for help obtaining. Oh, that is an unrelated question about guardianship appointments. And since we're at 11:59, I don't want to go super far down that road, but just send me a follow-up email and we can talk. Yeah, happy to do that. We're right at time. I'm going to go ahead and stop our recording. I will send it out to our communications person who will post it on YouTube. And then I have a link that I can share with folks that will come out with the handouts that we discussed today and anything else that I promised. Please feel free to reach out to me any other time with questions. We're going to be doing this webinar each quarter. So if there were things that you felt like, oh, this is where I learned the most, or this I didn't get, she didn't do a good job explaining that, or I really wish we talked about that, please, that feedback is most certainly welcome and I can incorporate it into future presentations. And then you are welcome to come back. Right? This, I feel like, is like drinking from a fire hose. I wouldn't expect anyone to gulp it all down the first time they hear it. It's a lot to think about. So just keep asking questions. Just keep coming back. We will figure it out. Like all things, it gets easier as time goes on. We are so very glad to be doing this with you all. Thank you so much for your time today. I look forward to hearing questions from people in the future. I look forward to hearing great stories when people are offered their waiver and are loving their services. And if you were seeing this recording, again, thearcofnova.org/answers to reach out anytime. Bye-bye, everyone. Thank you all.